He then definitively proved that the era of polished stone in Egypt preceded the era of polished stone, and that the latter was succeeded by the era of metal use, as was the case in England, France, and elsewhere. The results of his research were presented to the world. Since then, De Morgan, in 1897, actually acknowledged the existence of a prehistoric era in Egypt. Research then began to emerge, supporting the opinion of this great scholar or complementing his research, and sometimes correcting some of his errors in various points. Professor De Morgan's research paved the way for us to establish a connection between the Egyptian prehistory and the Old Kingdom, and he called this period the Predynastic Era. Stone later discovered new sites, and the two archaeologists, Legran and others, also discovered sites from this era in the desert region on the banks of the Nile. Carr and the German scientist noted the existence of several stations with Schweinfurt's instruments, and the professor pointed out that they date back to prehistoric times. The Nile and its importance in ancient Egyptian history. It is indisputable that Egypt was significantly different from what it is today when the first humans first appeared. In order to gain an idea of the country's natural state during this era, we must go back to ancient geological eras, that is, a relatively short period before the appearance of human influence. This era is known in the geological history of the Earth's crust as the Tertiary Geological Period. However, we will not discuss here the geological stages that preceded this ancient era, meaning the first two stages. We will also not discuss the first Nile, which preceded the current Nile. Rather, we will suffice here to mention some details essential for researchers in the history of Egypt and the nature of its land. The Egyptian crust consists of three successive layers. First, in the early geological period, we find that the soil consisted of crystalline schist rocks, granite, and then diorite. Porphyry is one of these rocks. Second, in the second geological period, we find that the soil consisted of sandstone. Third, at the beginning of the third period, limestone layers containing nummullite formations appeared. In fact, the aforementioned crystalline schist rocks are confined to the western desert and around the first cataract. Sandstone rocks, on the other hand, are found in Nubia and Upper Egypt, as far as Esna, and are also found in Luxor, near Cairo, and in the Kurga oasis. The limestone layers formed the Libyan desert, as well as the highlands that border the Nile River from Luxor to Cairo. There is no doubt that the dense Nubian sandstone masses that make up Egypt's soil have undergone many geological changes. In fact, it was sometimes partially covered by water and then reappeared, which made it easier for the limestone sea and then the nummullite sea to leave their sediments on the surface, forming thick limestone layers. These layers cover the Nubian sandstone everywhere from Edfu to the beginning of the delta. After this region finally emerged from the water, which occurred after the Eocene period, we find that the vast region later called Egypt emerged. However, its surface exhibited a double slope, gentle on one side and sloping on the other. The first slope runs from south to north, following the direction of the Nile. The second slope is steeper and begins from east to west, that is, from the shores of the Red Sea to the Oases region. These two inclines in the valley's natural terrain are undoubtedly due to volcanic phenomena that occurred in its eastern part and in the Sudanese region. The consequences of these phenomena are undoubtedly enormous from a geographical perspective, as they are like all other changes that the valley's surface was bound to undergo due to the influence of river water. In fact, the Nile River cut its course through this plateau, whose mountains are uneven in height, in a nearly straight line, forming two separate regions that differ markedly in height and shape. One is the eastern one, called the Arabian Desert. Its natural composition is characterized by its mountains reaching great heights near the coast, and then gradually descending towards the valley. The second region, called the Libyan Desert, begins with low hills that run along the sandy plain and ends in several depressions, some of which sometimes reach below sea level. These depressions are called oases. Thus, the structure of the land of the pharaohs was formed in the Tertiary Geological Period. At the end of this period and the beginning of the Quaternary Geological Period, atmospheric factors began to influence it until they carved the surface of this plateau into the present-day Nile Valley. Torrential floods used to fall in this area. Their magnitude and intensity can be gauged from the current tropical rains. These rains created several watercourses that acted as laborers in carving out several valleys in the rocks. These valleys have dried up since ancient times, but their locations still remain today, indicating their existence despite the depletion of their water. It appears that the Nile only established its current course in recent times. There is no doubt that its flow was obstructed in ancient times at the Aswan Highlands by a granite barrier. For a long time, it was unable to overcome these granite obstacles. The river's waters were forced to circulate around these massive blocks. Eventually, the force of the water prevailed, and it carved its current course. The stones of the first cataract remain a testament to the resistance that the river faced and continues to face in its flow. Furthermore, the river was obstructed by Nubian rocks, which are softer than granite. These rocks formed several small waterfalls from the beginning of the current city of Silsila to the south, obstructing the river's flow and creating obstacles in its path. Furthermore, the river encountered higher levels than its current course, necessitating the formation of several lakes in its wake in various parts of the valley. Nothing is more indicative of this than the remains of the dam that blocked the river at Gebel el Silsila. This dam also served as a reservoir for storing water that had been obstructed by the Kam Ombo Dam, a natural plain that blocked its path. Based on the system of natural laws and the formation of rivers, we can conclude that the Nile has undergone two distinct, successive eras in its history. First, the river initially had flowing waters that flowed rapidly from south to north, which allowed it to initially carve out a very large, shallow channel for itself over the years. This broad channel then gradually began to shrink, and the valley's profile during this phase resembled the figure 7. However, the variations in the annual volume of water flowing and the strength of the currents sometimes increased the intensity of erosion in the rocks and sometimes decreased it. The intensity or weakness of this erosion can be observed in the varying sizes of the terraces that can be seen one above the other along the riverbank. In fact, we now see it clearly in the rocks. Sometimes the terrace is wide and sometimes it is narrow, indicating the irregularity of natural phenomena. As for the second era, we observe that after the period during which the river carved its course, another period followed in which the course collided again. The explanation for this is that after the period during which the river carved its course, the lower part of the course was observed to be nearly as deep as sea level, and then stopped at this point. However, the action of erosion was still proceeding along the river's slope. However, the remains of this erosion were not completely swept to the sea due to the low gradient. Rather, they accumulated at the bottom of the river. These sediments increased from year to year at the bottom, causing the river's level to rise and reducing its steepness. Consequently, the flow of its water became moderate, and the country began to benefit from it. There is clear evidence of these changes in the course of the river from Aswan to the Mediterranean Sea. For example, in the Cairo area, during the third geological period, the Nile had a course whose width at this point reached a great extent. The Mokattam Mountains and the Pyramids Plateau were the two boundaries through which the river flowed during that period. However, in the fourth geological period, gradually, sediments began to fill this channel, consisting of gravel, which was then washed down by the current. Then, modern silt was pushed down, eventually becoming covered with silt. The wide channel gradually shrank until, at that point, nothing remained of this vast expanse except a small channel, no more than a few hundred meters wide. Eventually, the Nile began to flow into the Mediterranean Sea, though not through its current mouth, but rather through a triangular gulf about 200 kilometers from the sea. However, the sediments brought by the Nile annually gradually covered this mouth, forming the current delta. The old mouth occupies part of the present-day city of Cairo.